The lobby of the Grand Meridian Atlanta was the kind of place that made people instinctively straighten their posture. 40-foot ceilings soared above a polished marble floor that reflected the warm amber glow of imported chandeliers. Fresh white orchids lined the reception counter in precise, symmetrical arrangements. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and sandalwood, a custom fragrance developed exclusively for the property at considerable expense. Everything about the Grand Meridian had been designed to communicate one message without saying a single word, that the people who belonged here occupied a different world from everyone else. And on a Tuesday evening in late November, a man walked through its revolving glass doors who, by every visible measure, did not belong there at all. His name was Richard Hayes. He was 47 years old, 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that suggested a younger body than his salt and pepper hair implied. His charcoal dress shirt was wrinkled from hours behind the wheel, the collar slightly open, the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His dark slacks had lost their press somewhere along the 400 miles he had driven since dawn. A 5-day shadow of stubble covered his jaw. In his left hand, he carried a duffel bag, not a designer weekender, not a rolling hard case from a premium travel brand, but a plain canvas duffel that had been through enough years of use to show it. He moved across the marble floor with the unhurried, quiet ease of a man completely comfortable in his own skin, which was, for those who would have known better, the first clue that something about this man was not what it appeared to be. Richard Hayes had not always moved through the world this way. There had been years-long, grinding, humbling years when he had walked into rooms like this one from the other side of the rope, card in hand, name tag pinned to a uniform that did not fit right. He had started his working life as a front desk clerk at a mid-budget chain hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina. At the age of 22, earning $11 an hour and learning one interaction at a time what hospitality actually meant. Not what the training manuals said it meant. What it actually, viscerally meant. The difference between a guest who felt seen and a guest who felt processed. He had never forgotten that difference. In many ways, it had become the foundation of everything he later built. Over the course of 2 decades, through a combination of relentless work, strategic vision, and the kind of carefully accumulated debt that keeps a man awake past midnight, staring at spreadsheets, Richard had transformed that early experience into something that now spanned 22 properties across 9 states. The Hayes Collection, what had begun as a single boutique hotel in Savannah, acquired at auction for far less than it was worth because everyone else had written it off, was now a premium hospitality brand, with an annual revenue exceeding $600 million. Industry publications had profiled his growth strategy. Business schools had used his expansion model as a case study. Competitors had tried to replicate what he built and found that the thing they could never quite copy was the culture, a service philosophy that Richard had personally authored and still personally enforced. In his own quiet, unannounced way, the Grand Meridian Atlanta was the crown jewel of the collection. The flagship, the property Richard had sunk the most capital into. The one that bore his highest expectations. The one he had told his team, more than once, represented not just what the Hayes Collection was but what it believed in. He had not visited it in 8 months. 8 months during which his attention had been pulled toward an acquisition in Denver, a renovation in Nashville, and a legal dispute with a contractor in Miami that had cost him far more energy than money. 8 months during which, apparently, things had drifted. He had not called ahead. He never did. That was the point. Richard had established early in his career as an owner that surprise visits were the only honest audits a hospitality business could conduct. You could read every guest satisfaction survey ever submitted, review every quarterly operations report, sit in every performance review, and still never know the truth about how your brand was being lived inside its own walls, not until you walked in as a nobody and saw it for yourself. So he walked in as a nobody. He always did. And tonight, as he crossed the threshold of the Grand Meridian Atlanta with a wrinkled shirt and a canvas bag and the look of a man who had been driving too long, he was already watching. The lobby was active for a Tuesday. A cluster of guests in business attire waited near the elevator bank with luggage. A couple consulted a paper map near the concierge desk. The concierge, Richard noted, had his back partially turned to them. Two bellmen stood near the entrance, and one of them tracked Richard's progress across the floor with an expression that was not quite suspicion, but was not quite neutrality either. Richard did not break stride. He had seen that look before. He understood exactly what it meant. And he filed it away with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man who had taught himself to notice everything. He reached the reception desk and stopped. There were 3 staff members visible behind the long marble counter. 2 of them were engaged with guests, or appeared to be, though one was typing something on a keyboard, while the guest she was supposedly helping waited in a silence that suggested the typing had been going on for some time. The 3rd staff member, a young woman with auburn hair pulled back severely from her face, was not helping anyone. She stood slightly apart from the others, one hand resting on the counter, reviewing something on a tablet screen. Her name tag read, Emily. She looked up when Richard approached, and the assessment she made of him in the next 3 seconds was visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Her expression did not shift dramatically. It was subtler than that, a slight flattening of affect, a micro-withdrawal of the energy she might otherwise have extended to someone whose appearance suggested a larger room category. She looked back at her tablet. Richard waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things the years had taught him, that patience, genuine patience rather than the performance of it, communicated confidence more effectively than any aggressive assertion of presence. He waited while Emily continued reviewing her tablet. He waited while a couple in expensive coats arrived at the desk from the other side, and were greeted almost immediately by one of the other clerks with a warmth that seemed to materialize from nowhere. He waited while a man in a tailored suit was waved forward with a smile that reached the clerk's eyes. After approximately 4 minutes, during which Richard Hayes, the owner of the building he was standing in, had been made to feel invisible in his own lobby, Emily set down the tablet and looked at him. Checking in? The word checking landed without inflection, without welcome, without the small but significant human warmth that costs nothing to give and means everything to receive. Richard said yes, gave his name, and placed the credit card he intended to use on the marble counter. Emily took it. She looked at it. She looked at her screen. She typed something. Then she looked at him again with an expression that managed to convey doubt without technically expressing it. "Do you have a reservation?" He did not. He explained that he had not made one, that he was hoping to book a suite for several nights on arrival. This was, he knew, perfectly reasonable, given the current occupancy levels. He had reviewed the booking data that morning. Emily's response was to glance at the credit card again, then back at the screen, as though the card and the screen together might tell her something the man standing in front of her could not. She asked, not quietly, but not loudly enough to be conspicuous, which was somehow worse, whether he was aware of the nightly rate for suite accommodations at the Grand Meridian. Richard said he was. She asked whether he was certain his card could handle an extended booking. He said he was certain. She looked at him for a moment in a way that made clear she was not certain. Then she began typing again, slowly, with the particular kind of deliberate slowness that is not inefficiency but intention. Another guest approached the desk, this one in a camel-colored wool overcoat, luggage handled by a bellman who had materialized from somewhere the moment the man had arrived. Emily's posture shifted. The flatness in her expression gave way to something approaching professional warmth. She held up a finger in Richard's direction, a gesture that managed to convey both a request for patience and a statement about relative priority, and turned her full attention to the man in the camel coat. Richard watched this. He watched all of it with the same quiet, comprehensive attention he had been applying since he walked through the door. A few other guests nearby had noticed the exchange. An older woman waiting near the seating area caught Richard's eye for a moment, and something in her expression suggested that she, too, understood what was happening at the desk. Richard gave her the smallest nod of acknowledgement, not commiseration, just recognition. Then he looked back at the counter and waited. When Emily returned to him, her manner had not improved. She informed him that the available suite category started at a particular nightly rate, and she cited the figure with a slight emphasis, as if the number itself were a screening mechanism. Richard confirmed that was fine. She asked if he had any loyalty membership number. He gave her a number, She typed it in, and whatever came up on her screen caused a brief, almost imperceptible pause, but she recovered from it quickly and continued with an air that suggested she had decided to disregard what she had seen. She asked for identification. He provided it. She examined it with more attention than strictly necessary. Then, as if the decision had been made somewhere upstream of conscious thought, she began constructing an explanation for why check-in might be complicated this evening. It was at approximately this point that Emily called for the manager on duty. His name, as Richard would learn momentarily, was Michael Garrett. He appeared from the back office with the particular energy of a man who has just been interrupted doing something he considered more important than whatever he was being called to address. He was in his mid-30s, broad through the chest, with the kind of practiced authority in his bearing that is learned rather than earned. He wore his uniform well and moved through the lobby with the ease of someone who had been the most important person in this room for long enough to mistake that local condition for a permanent truth about himself. He looked at Emily, who indicated Richard with a slight tilt of her chin. Michael Garrett looked at Richard Hayes with the expression of a man assessing a situation he believed he already understood. "Good evening." The greeting was formal rather than welcoming. "Is there a problem here?" Richard said there was not a problem, that he was simply trying to check in, and that the process seemed to have encountered some friction he was hoping to resolve. He said it levelly, without edge, in the tone of a reasonable man explaining a reasonable situation. Michael listened to this with his arms loosely at his sides, and the particular stillness of someone who has already drawn a conclusion and is simply waiting for the other person to stop talking. What happened next was something Richard would later describe, in the calmest possible terms, as a demonstration of everything he had spent 2 decades trying to prevent. Michael Garrett did not raise his voice. He did not use any language that was explicitly offensive. What he did was deploy the sophisticated cruelty of institutional gatekeeping, the kind that hides behind policy language and professional tone while communicating, with absolute precision, that the person on the receiving end does not belong. He spoke at a volume calibrated to be heard not just by Richard, but by the guests and staff nearby. He expressed, with elaborate courtesy, a series of concerns about the booking request. He referenced the exclusive nature of the property and its clientele. He made observations about the current demand for rooms that implied a scarcity Richard almost certainly could not compete with. And then, with the air of someone reluctantly delivering unfortunate news to a person who should have known better than to come here at all, he informed Richard that the Grand Meridian was, unfortunately, unable to accommodate him this evening. Richard asked for the specific grounds of that decision. Michael said it was a matter of hotel policy. Richard asked which policy. Michael said it was a matter of guest experience standards. Richard said he understood the importance of guest experience and asked again for the specific policy being applied. Michael's expression shifted not into anger, exactly, but into the kind of compressed impatience that a powerful person in a contained space directs at someone they consider to be wasting their time. He said the hotel reserved the right to decline bookings at its discretion. Richard acknowledged that was true, in principle, and asked whether there was a specific documented reason for the discretion being applied in this case. There was not, and both men knew it. What was happening had no policy behind it. It had only a prejudice, the rapid, confident, completely mistaken assessment that the man standing at the Grand Meridian's reception desk in a wrinkled shirt and 5 days of stubble was someone who could be managed away without consequence. Michael Garrett was not a cruel man in any absolute sense. He was, however, a man who had allowed himself to become comfortable in a position of authority that had never been properly checked, and who had gradually drifted toward a version of hospitality management in which the comfort of certain guests came at the direct expense of the dignity of others. Among the small group of people observing this exchange was a woman named Sandra Holloway. Sandra was 53 years old and had worked at the Grand Meridian since its opening. She had seen things in this lobby that she did not always agree with, and she had, over the years, learned when to speak and when to absorb what she was seeing and process it later. But as she watched Michael Garrett tell this quiet, composed man that he could not be helped, And as she watched Richard Hayes respond not with the frustration or embarrassment of someone who had been wrongly diminished, but with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who was gathering information, something shifted in her understanding of the situation. She did not know who Richard Hayes was, but she had worked in hospitality for 3 decades, and she had developed an instinct, reliable as a tuning fork, for the difference between a person who was uncertain of their standing and a person who was entirely, unshakably certain of it. The man at that desk was certain, and the certainty was not the bluster of someone overcompensating. It was something quieter and more absolute than that. Richard asked Michael Garrett for his full name and employee identification number. He asked Emily for the same. He wrote nothing down. He simply listened to the information when it was given, and then he said, with perfect courtesy, that he understood, that he would step outside for a few minutes, and that he appreciated their time. Michael watched him go with the expression of a man who has handled a situation and now considers it closed. Emily returned to her tablet. The lobby continued its quiet hum of activity, and the marble floor reflected the light of the chandeliers, and the orchids held their symmetrical positions along the counter, and none of the people in that room, not one of them, had any idea what was about to happen. Richard walked to the far end of the lobby, past the seating area with its deep leather chairs, past a large arrangement of autumn branches in a glass vessel, to a quieter alcove near the hotel's business center. He sat down in a chair, took out his phone, and made a call. It lasted less than 4 minutes. His voice, for the duration of that call, was measured and quiet. He did not express anger. He did not use theatrical language. He simply told the person on the other end of the line what he had observed, not just the incident at the desk, but the bellman's expression at the door, the concierge with his back turned, the staged slowness of Emily's processing, the calculated volume of Michael's refusal. He told them he would be staying in the lobby. He told them he would like a regional meeting convened within the hour. Then he ended the call, settled back in the chair, and waited. Back at the reception desk, the incident had already become the subject of low-voiced commentary between Emily and a colleague. The tenor of that commentary was not remorse. They had dealt with someone who didn't quite fit, and the fitting out had gone smoothly enough, and now the lobby had returned to its normal equilibrium. Michael Garrett had retreated to his office, where he was reviewing reservation reports with the satisfaction of a man whose professional instincts had once again served him well. Neither of them understood that the call had already been made. Neither of them understood that somewhere in the organizational structure above them, people were being pulled from dinners and meetings and evening routines to respond to a message from a number that caused a particular kind of stillness in everyone who received it. 40 minutes after Richard Hayes sat down in the alcove near the business center, 2 vehicles pulled up in front of the Grand Meridian Atlanta. From the first emerged the regional vice president of operations for the Southeast Division, a man named David Ellison, who had spent 11 years climbing to his current position and who, in those 11 years, had received exactly 1 call of this particular variety. A call that required him to drop everything and appear. From the second vehicle came 3 senior members of the corporate leadership team, including the director of brand standards, the chief people officer, and a general counsel who happened to have been having dinner 2 miles away. They entered the lobby with the coordinated purposefulness of people who understand exactly why they are there, and within moments of their arrival, the energy of the lobby had shifted in a way that was palpable, without being specific. Staff noticed. Guests noticed. A bellman near the door straightened his posture without being aware that he had done so. David Ellison crossed the lobby directly to the alcove where Richard Hayes was sitting. He stopped in front of him, and then he did something that a number of people in the lobby were close enough to observe. He bowed his head in a way that was not a casual nod of greeting but a genuine, deliberate gesture of deference. He said, quietly, that he was sorry, that he was deeply sorry, that he had learned what had happened this evening, and he wanted Richard to know that it could not reflect what the Hayes collection stood for. Richard accepted this acknowledgement without theatrics. He rose from the chair and asked David to walk with him. They moved back across the marble floor toward the reception desk. Emily was there. Another clerk was there, Michael Garrett, who had emerged from his office upon noticing the arrival of the corporate vehicles and had been standing near the back of the lobby trying to understand what he was seeing, was also there. What he saw. As Richard Hayes approached the desk alongside the regional vice president, the director of brand standards, the chief people officer, and a woman he vaguely recognized from a photograph as belonging to corporate legal, was the particular arrangement of facts that tells a person they have made a very serious mistake. David Ellison introduced Richard Hayes to the assembled staff in the language that the moment required. Founder of the Hayes Collection, sole owner of the property and all assets within it, the person whose signature had appeared at the bottom of every major decision this hotel had ever benefited from. He said it simply, without embellishment. Because the facts required no embellishment, the sound that went through the lobby at that moment was not loud. It was the specific, particular silence of a room full of people who have just collectively revised their understanding of reality. Emily set down the folder she had been holding. Michael Garrett said nothing. His face had taken on the color and expression of someone experiencing the sensation of the floor dropping away beneath them. Because it was. Richard turned to the broader assembled team, not just the front desk staff, but the bellmen, the concierge who had materialized from somewhere. A cluster of housekeeping staff who had been passing through, a handful of guests who had remained to observe, and he said, in a voice pitched for the room, that he wanted to understand some things. He asked for access to the security footage from the past several hours. He asked for the service logs from the past 30 days. He asked for the complaint records and the guest satisfaction data that had been filed in the past quarter. He asked for all of it with the calm specificity of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for, because he has been building and protecting something for 20 years, and he can tell when it has been damaged. What the footage and records revealed over the next 2 hours was worse, in some ways, than the incident that had precipitated the review. The footage confirmed what Richard had experienced, but it also confirmed patterns that extended well beyond his own visit. There were instances of guests being redirected from preferred seating based on appearance. There were records of complaints from guests who described feeling unwelcome that had been closed without proper follow-up. There were service log entries that revealed a culture of selective engagement of warmth, reserved for certain guests, and withheld from others based on criteria that had nothing to do with membership tier, reservation, history, or any documented policy. The data told a story that Richard recognized, because he had seen it before in operations where a single powerful middle management voice had been allowed, unchallenged, to redefine the culture of a property from the inside. Michael Garrett attempted, as the evidence accumulated, to contextualize what he was seeing. He offered explanations. He referenced the pressures of the role, the pace of operations, the difficulty of managing staff in a high-demand environment. He said there were nuances that the data did not capture. Richard listened to each of these explanations with the same patient, attentive expression he had maintained throughout the evening, and then he asked a question in response to each one, a specific, data-grounded question that the explanation did not and could not answer. Michael was intelligent enough to recognize eventually that the interrogation he was being subjected to was not adversarial theater. It was documentation. Every exchange was being witnessed by corporate legal. Every response he gave was going into a record that would inform decisions being made in real time. A few of the other staff members had been quiet observers of this process. Sandra Holloway was among them. She had been asked, along with several colleagues, to remain available, and she stood to one side of the lobby's seating area, watching the man she had identified 2 hours ago as something other than what he appeared to be conduct, the most methodical, unemotional audit of a live hospitality operation she had ever witnessed. She felt, as she watched, a complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow. Vindication because her instinct had been right. Sorrow because the culture she was watching being excavated was one she had lived inside, had sometimes been complicit in simply by remaining silent, and whose damage was now irrefutable. Richard asked for the meeting he had requested. Not a debrief. A meeting with all available staff, across shifts, conducted in the ballroom because the ballroom was large enough. Staff were summoned. tables were arranged. At approximately 10:45 on a Tuesday night, Richard Hayes stood at the front of the Grand Meridian Atlanta's smaller ballroom and addressed approximately 60 members of the hotel's team, some still in uniform, some who had been called in, some who had been finishing their shifts and asked to stay. He began by asking a question. He asked each person in the room to think about why they had chosen to work in hospitality. Not what their job title was, not what their metrics were, not what their targets were, but why. Why they had chosen to be in a business built around the care of other human beings. He gave them a moment with the question. Some people shifted in their seats. Some people genuinely engaged with it, their expressions going inward. A few people gave answers when he opened the floor, thoughtful answers, some of them. Answers that reminded Richard why he had built this company in the first place. Then he asked a different kind of question. He asked them to describe what they believed the Grand Meridian's service philosophy was. He called on people at random, gently, without pressure. The answers he received were technically accurate in the way that recited principles often are. The words were right, but the weight behind them was inconsistent. Some people spoke about dignity and inclusion with the fluency of genuine conviction. Others offered the same phrases with the hollow precision of someone reciting from a document they have read but never believed. Richard noticed the difference. He always noticed the difference. He told them about Michael Garrett. He told them that effective immediately, Michael Garrett's contract with the Hayes Collection was terminated. He said it without drama, without anger, without any of the performative weight that would have made it a spectacle rather than a statement of consequence. He said that Emily Richardson's employment was also being concluded. Citing specific violations of the service standards every person in the room had agreed to uphold when they joined the company. He said that 2 other individuals whose behavior had been documented in the review would be subject to formal disciplinary processes. And then, before the weight of those announcements could calcify into fear, he said something else. He said he was not here to make them afraid. He said fear was not a culture. Fear was the opposite of a culture. What he had spent his working life trying to build was something different, a place where people who walked through the doors, regardless of what they were wearing or where they had come from or how much money they appeared to have, felt that they mattered, not as revenue units, not as potential review scores, as people. He paused. The room was very quiet. Then Richard Hayes told them about a period in his own life that he did not discuss often, that he had, in fact, never discussed in any public context, because it was not a story he had built his brand on or used to generate sympathy or relatability in interviews. It was simply true, and he had carried it the way a person carries the weight that shapes them. He told them that 15 years ago, when his daughter Emma was 3 years old, he had lost his wife, Claire, to an illness that had moved through her body over the course of 8 months, with the particular cruelty of something that gives you just enough time to understand what is being taken from you. He told them that after Claire died, he had been left with a 3-year-old daughter, a mortgage on a property he was not sure he could hold, and the kind of grief that does not respond well to the usual counsel about time and healing. He told them that in the months that followed, he had been seen by the world as something that the world sometimes makes of single fathers in the early stages of grief, someone slightly unmanaged, slightly outside the boundaries of the acceptable, someone whose clothes were often not quite right, and whose attention was sometimes visibly elsewhere. He had been in rooms where he felt the assessment moving across him before anyone had spoken, and he had known what that assessment said, that he was not someone to be taken seriously, that he did not belong in certain conversations, at certain tables, in certain spaces. He said he had been wrong about many things in his life, but he had never been wrong about what those moments felt like. And he said that when he walked through the door of the Grand Meridian that evening and experienced what he experienced, the feeling was not new to him. The specifics were new, the scale was new, but the feeling, the particular, quiet diminishment of being evaluated and found wanting before a single real exchange had occurred that he knew from the inside. He said he had built the Hayes Collection on the belief that hospitality, done honestly, was one of the few industries in which the decision to treat every human being with equivalent dignity was not a philosophical position, but a practical one, that it cost nothing to offer warmth. That the absence of warmth was not neutrality, it was a choice, with consequences that compounded in ways that most managers never tracked because they were too busy watching the metrics that felt easier to count. He said, "A guest in a wrinkled shirt and a canvas bag might be a tired father who has been driving since morning. Might be a schoolteacher on the first real vacation she has taken in 4 years. Might be a veteran returning home. Might be someone who has just buried a parent and does not have the emotional bandwidth for anything other than a room that feels safe and a front desk that does not make them feel like a problem to be managed." He said, "You do not know. You never know. And the practice of acting as if you know of making decisions about human worth based on a 5-second visual assessment is not just ethically wrong. It is a failure of the basic skill this work requires." Several people in the room were crying quietly. Not because of the terminations, not out of fear, but because the words were landing in places that personal experience had already prepared for them. Sandra Holloway was not crying. She was listening with an attention that she recognized, from a long career in rooms like this one, as the quality she had most rarely encountered in a person of significant authority, not just the willingness to say true things, but the willingness to be genuinely seen saying them. The meeting ended after midnight. Richard shook hands with people as they left. He learned names. He asked questions. He thanked the ones who had been willing to speak honestly during the meeting. And he noted without making the noting public which ones those were. Before the last person filed out of the ballroom, he told them that he would be staying at the Grand Meridian for the next 7 days, not to audit them in the formal sense, not to watch for infractions, but because this property was the flagship of something he cared about deeply, and because he wanted to understand how to help it become again what it was always supposed to be. He spent the next 7 days doing exactly what he had said. He was present in the lobby in the mornings, sometimes at the desk, sometimes seated in the lounge with a coffee and a notebook, watching and learning. He held small group sessions with housekeeping, with the concierge team, with the restaurant staff, with the night shift front desk team who almost never saw anyone from corporate, and whose surprise at his presence dissolved, over the course of those conversations, into something that looked a great deal like engagement. He asked questions more than he gave directives. He listened to the staff the way he had listened to his earliest mentors in the industry, with the assumption that the people closest to the work usually understand the work better than the people farthest from it. He found things that needed changing, not just protocols, not just staffing, but assumptions, the invisible architecture of a workplace culture that had, under Michael Garrett's management, gradually drifted from a set of genuine values toward a set of performances. The performances had been good enough to pass most standard reviews. They had not been good enough to survive a Tuesday night when the owner of the building walked in unannounced in a wrinkled shirt and a canvas bag and gave the culture an honest look at itself. Sandra Holloway was promoted. Richard had noticed her the moment he walked back across the lobby with David Ellison. Noticed the quality of her attention, the steadiness of her expression. He spoke with her at length on the 3rd day of his stay, learning in that conversation that she had been the most senior non-management front desk staff member in the property, and that she had, for years, been passed over for advancement by a management chain that preferred a particular kind of confidence in its leaders, the performed, expansive variety over the quieter, more grounded kind that Sandra represented. He offered her an interim management role that would be evaluated for permanence at the end of a 90-day period. She accepted with a composure that he found, privately, impressive. He also spent time with guests. Not in any formal capacity, not introducing himself, not soliciting feedback in the organized way that a guest satisfaction survey organizes it. He simply talked to people, in the elevator, at breakfast, in the lobby bar in the evenings. He asked them how their stay was going, and listened to their answers, with the same quality of attention that he had brought to everything else that week. Several guests mentioned that the hotel felt different this week, more alive, somehow more attentive. One older gentleman, who was staying at the Grand Meridian for what he said was the 4th time in 2 years, told Richard, in the casual way of someone making small talk with another guest, that the place had a warmth this week that he did not remember from his previous visits. He said it was hard to put a finger on what exactly was different. He said it just felt like the people here actually wanted to be here. Richard thanked him. He did not explain who he was. It was not the point. On the last evening of his stay, Richard walked through the lobby after dinner. The chandeliers were on their evening setting, slightly warmer than during the day. The orchids had been refreshed. The concierge was deep in conversation with a family who appeared to be planning something elaborate. And the concierge's posture and expression were those of a person genuinely engaged in helping someone solve a problem. At the front desk, a young man who had been visibly nervous during the ballroom meeting 5 days earlier was checking in a guest, a woman in her 60s in a plain winter coat, no luggage beyond a single rolling carry-on, the look of someone who had been traveling for a long time. Richard watched the young man greet her. He watched him ask how her journey had been, listen to her answer, offer something that made her smile. He watched him handle the check-in with a care that was not performance. It was real. Richard stood in the lobby for a few more minutes, watching the room do what a lobby, done right, is supposed to do: make people feel received, make them feel that whatever they have come from and whatever they are carrying, they have arrived somewhere that is prepared to take them seriously. It was a simple thing. It was also, he had spent his entire career learning, one of the most difficult things to sustain. He left the next morning without a formal departure ceremony, the way he had arrived with a bag over one shoulder and no announcement. He said goodbye to Sandra at the desk. He said goodbye to a few others he had come to know over the week. As he crossed the marble floor toward the revolving glass doors, he passed a man in a paint-splattered jacket who was crossing the lobby in the opposite direction, someone who had clearly come in from the cold and looked uncertain of his welcome. A front desk clerk Richard had spoken with twice that week caught his eye from across the room, offered a nod of acknowledgement, and then turned to the man in the paint-splattered jacket with a smile that was immediate and genuine. Richard pushed through the glass doors. Outside, the Atlanta morning was cold and bright. The sky, the particular clear blue that comes after an overnight rain. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, bag in hand, and then he walked to his car. He had driven perhaps 3 blocks when he allowed himself to think about what the week had been, not the incident that had started it, not the meeting, not the terminations or the promotions or the operational reviews, but the thing underneath all of it, the thing he had tried, over 20 years and 22 properties, to protect from the entropy that waits for every institution that begins with genuine values, and gradually, if not carefully tended, allows those values to become language rather than practice. He thought about Emma, who was 18 now and had recently told him she wanted to study hospitality management because she had grown up watching what hospitality could be when it was done with integrity. He thought about Claire, who had believed, from the beginning of their time together, that the work he was trying to do mattered not because of the revenue or the brand recognition or the industry reputation, but because of what it meant to give a person, even for one night, the experience of being fully welcomed. He thought about the man in the paint-splattered jacket, walking across that lobby this morning and being met with a smile. He thought about the older gentleman who had said the place felt different that week, that the people here seemed to actually want to be there. He thought about the front desk clerk who had been nervous in the ballroom and was not nervous anymore, and about Sandra, standing at the desk with the easy authority of someone who has finally been given the space to do what she has always known how to do. The things we build, Richard believed, are always secondary to the way we build them. The building itself, the marble, the chandeliers, the custom fragrance in the carefully conditioned air that was the container. But the container meant nothing without what was held inside it, and what the Hayes collection had always been trying to hold inside it was something much simpler and much harder than any physical structure. The practice of seeing another person, fully and without condition, as someone who deserves to be here. Wealth. He had learned the kind that outlasts the market cycles and the operational challenges, and the long years of uncertainty does not live in what you own. It lives in what you protect, and what Richard Hayes had spent 20 years learning to protect, imperfectly. Across 22 properties and hundreds of thousands of guest interactions and one long Tuesday night in a marble lobby in Atlanta was not a brand. It was a belief that every person who walks through a door deserves to be treated as though their presence matters. Not because of what they are wearing, not because of what their credit card implies, not because of what they might spend or review or recommend, but because they are here, and being here is enough, and the only true measure of what a place stands for is how it treats the person who walked in looking like they might not belong, and then made them feel, without condition, that they do.